So thanks for having me to come here and speak about this topic. I'm just going to be reading right off this, so if you don't get any eye contact, it's not because I hate you. Some of you may have heard the name Michel Focault, where others of you have not. However, I doubt there is anyone in this room that hasn't heard or even been influenced by his ideas in your own critical examinations of our society. This is not to say that you would agree with his notions or knowledge of power or his methodologies of genealogy. But the residue of his ideas permeates in academic circles, even amongst those who hold themselves to be the movers and shakers of today's society. Out of the many recastings and histories that Foucault produced, the one that you may be liable to hear in word or by meaning is a certain application of governmentality called biopolitics. Biopolitics is a particular element of Foucault's thought that I have been asked here to speak about today. Foucault points out aptly, though, in his own lecture series known as The Birth of Biopolitics, that biopolitics is vastly connected to liberalism. To quote, "Only when we know what the governmental regime called liberalism was, will we be able to grasp what biopolitics is." Foucault's roadmap, to a certain extent, will be our own roadmap. However, before we even do this, and in order to make Foucault's notion of liberalism and biopolitics more intelligible, it is important to render a little more background on Foucault's intellectual work so that we won't drown in an ocean of unfamiliar concepts or methods. In order to first grasp the intellectual paces of Michel Focault, it is informative to know how he uses a particular methodology rendering the past called genealogy. Whereas a lot of other more popular philosophers claim to carry on the work of a great intellectual forefather, or otherwise explicitly, much might be said about Foucault's relationship with Friedrich Nietzsche. Foucault says in many places that he is in fact a Nietzschean. This admission takes on several admissions and stripes throughout Foucault's career as an intellectual, but as for his published writings, no practice of Nietzsche comes through quite as strongly as that practice that Foucault used from Nietzsche, known as genealogy. In Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, the examination of moral reasoning and effects are examined from the perspective of that particular frame of time, rather than a double glossing of perspective, which is the more traditional approach to history. The traditional approach could be characterized as an attempt to understand history by recasting it through its current ideology to render a coherent story, complete with heroes, events, and foreshadowing. From the very beginning of Foucault's work, it is important for him to examine history according to the reasons and evidence inherent to that particular time. The thinking and reasoning provided by various persons, accounts, pieces of arts, and other artifacts provide their own history and their own reasoning. Foucault's first book, History of Madness, inaugurated this method of genealogy, which showed the knowledge and order of history from the Renaissance to the beginning of the 20th century. This book showed the genealogy of how each shift in the needs of society changed its understandings, boundaries, and treatments from the altered truth of madness. Since his first book, Foucault's genealogical method has been used almost without exclusion in his exploratory books, often creating a space for history and knowledge and power where before only more narrow interpretations previously existed. To take a slightly more applicable topic at hand, the genealogical approach that makes Foucault's approach to the stark contrast between liberalism and Neo-Liberalism and the associated hard turn to biopolitics, it's what makes it so elegant. Indeed, Foucault had this specifically to say on his analysis of liberalism and biopolitics. So what I would like to deploy here is exactly the opposite of historicism, not questioning universals by using history as a critical method, but by starting from the definition that universals do not exist and asking what type of history we can do. This brings me to the other piece that is important to the understanding before moving on to biopolitics, which is the understanding of knowledge and power. When one studies Foucault, it becomes quickly apparent that knowledge and power share this joint or a similar sort of relationship that space and time enjoy in Einsteinian physics. This is so much the case that the understanding of Foucault often leaves the user saying something like knowledge/power, or sometimes one word is used that implies the other. Foucault implores this in some of his earlier writings. We should abandon the whole tradition that allows us to imagine that knowledge can exist only where power relationships are suspended, and knowledge can develop outside of its injunctions. It demands its demands and its interests. Perhaps we should abandon the belief that power makes us mad, and by that same token, the renunciation of power is one of the conditions for knowledge. We should admit, rather, that power produces knowledge, not simply by encouraging it, or by believing that it's applied because it's useful, and that power and knowledge directly apply one another. That there is no power relationship without a correlative constitution of a field of knowledge. This concept is seemingly easy for some to grasp, while others fail to grasp its deeper implications. I'd like to demonstrate a popular misunderstanding of this for the purposes of clarity. Of course, we're all familiar with the cliche phrase, knowledge is power, which is a phrase they chant at MBC or at the end of G.I. Joe or something. The sense of is here is used, best fits the notion of the is of cause. That is to say, if I have knowledge, then I can have some sort of modem of control greater than it had previously. Sort of like getting an answer to the Sphinx's riddle for the purposes of saving Thebes. But this is precisely what Foucault doesn't mean. Knowledge power for Foucault isn't something that some grand wizard dictates from some top unitary vision. Power is everywhere, not because it embraces everything, but because it comes from everywhere. Everything in a certain sense creates or reinforces knowledge. Who are you? Are you normal? Are you deviant? What gender are you? Are you rational? What is that thing you're holding? You can see that these basic questions of intelligibility not grant in some nefarious sense necessarily into some power, but it's a modality of behavior, questions, and positions in regards to the way we know ourselves, but also the way we also render the universe intelligible. With this as the jumping point, we can get a glimpse of the sort of inseparable relationship that knowledge and power that Foucault puts forward. And now with these two basic concepts in our belt, we're able to achieve a closer orbit to the topic at hand. As many of you know already, liberalism and capitalism share a lot of history together, but you also know that it's not necessary for one another. In fact, liberalism was something that came later after capitalism had been jump-started. The beginnings of biopower, that is to say, a knowledge and discipline of bodies that had a different origin, also had a different origin from liberalism. Schedules kept by monks made use of a clock that could track the minutes and precise hours. At the time of its development was virtually worthless to everyone else because nobody had a need to regulate their day the way that monks desired. A little further in the future, independently, the bodily uniformity of newly generated musket units spread all over Europe, none of which had nothing to do with capitalism or liberalism at all. With time, biopower spread over all different major institutions. It should seem intuitive that biopower aims to make things more efficient in an economic sense, almost as if by default, though the beginning saw many uses for many different ends. In the army, the end was efficiency. In other institutions like prisons, the end of biopower was morality and corrections. In school, biopower was exercised for assessment and guidance, and the list goes on. Eventually, we see the continued socialization of labor as persistent drive for efficiency starting to increase for more highly efficient, disciplined bodies. The use of biopower in the workshop is inevitable. To quote, biopower without a question was an indispensable element in the development of capitalism. The latter would have been impossible without the controls insertion of bodies into the machinery of production and the adjustment of the phenomena of the population to the economic process. So what's all this about biopower and biopolitics? Are they the same thing? The quick and uncareful answer is no. They are related though, and it's historically relevant that I bring up biopower, and I promise it isn't a distinction merely brought up for the purposes of grandiosity. As we know, for Foucault, power is not top-down. The particular configuration of biopower has two sorts of branches. The first of these is the developing of a certain knowledge and control of micro-control over bodies. It works on the level of uniformity of bodily capacities, efficiencies, and usefulness. In a word, procedures that work towards docility, which should be understood as a process of domestication rather than submissiveness. The second is the genus of biopower focuses on the body still, but instead of working on a micro or individual level, it works on the level of groups or population. Knowledge that works on this level of biopower is less in the level of this is a fork and this is how it's used, and more along the lines of birth control, sexuality, health, and morality. This may seem somewhat vague, but there are a couple of examples in this type of knowledge that are more easily recognizable in our current era. Think, for instance, all the societal knowledge about depression. Who has it? What does one do when one has it? How does one avoid it? There's a whole discourse on health that is strangely deinstitutionalized that runs parallel to the more official version, yet loses none of its veracity. The second type of biopower becomes politics, but the catalyst for this unique type of power changes and occur in the shift of knowledge of economics and reorders and changes the truth mechanisms that of how our society runs. In a word, it becomes biopolitics when it assumes a more dominant effect of a liberal style of governmentality. Before liberalism, the marketplace was a site of justice. The various kings all over Europe had fairly tight regulation over the price of goods in their respective kingdoms, which is suiting given that the tax and tithe system of feudalism left serfs with a very controlled share of things. As a result, the merchant class was kept tightly under thumb, and it was illegal to set prices too high to keep peasants fed, etc. Prior to liberalism, the sovereign practiced a style of theory of governmentality that at the heart might be referred to as the will of the king, or slightly before liberal governmentality, the will of the state. Jurists, courts, monarchy, and other assorted experts created a sort of verification of truth of the sovereign. The king acted accordingly or correctly insofar as fulfilling its kingly duties. Such a knowledge of proper rulership sounds entirely too self-referential. In a way, it allowed for a sort of unlimited purview of the sovereign. In another way, it told the king how it was that he was supposed to rule. Markets, for instance, is not merely the right, but also the duty to administrate. Particularly, the theory of wealth locked in this sort of style of governmentality. The knowledge on wealth at the time was that it was always a zero-sum game. The only way that wealth could be gained is had from another king by either taking it or trading it with other nations. There was no obsession with efficiency, no mutually advantageous benefit. Everything was done as the will of the king. It was largely the work of economic intellectuals during the time that changed this history of wealth, changed the theory of wealth, which over time literally reordered the way that people lived their lives, and in particular, relationship to the sovereign. More notably, it was the physiocrats who believed that wealth was, at its heart, had to do with agricultural production, who introduced this new knowledge, which is now recognized as political economics. As opposed to the previous theory of wealth, the physiocrats believed that efficiency and productivity was not just a zero-sum game economically. As a result, with the concomitant effort of jurists, creating an effect of getting the sovereigns of various nations to allow unregulated markets. What is remarkable about the physiocrats is how they created a new sort of language of naturalness and truth endemic to that time and that period of economics, due to its various influences of modernism and such. Focault summarizes their findings as such. When you allow the market to function by itself according to its nature, according to its natural truth, if you like, it permits the formation of a certain price which will be called metaphorically the true price, and it will sometimes be called the just price, but which no longer has any connotation of justice. This change in the theory of wealth, however, only started to affect governmentality within its current discourse that it resided. The reasoning was still the old one. It's best for the king to open up the markets so that his will be done. Often through a series of deaths, coups, revolution, and sometimes even a more gradual pace, the different theory of governmentality began to take hold. In addition to this era where we see the disappearances of the sovereign both formally and informally, the whole purpose of the government reformulated around a different set of purposes, questions, and techniques. Focault explains, the question of critical governmental reason will turn out not to be to govern too much. The objection will no longer be the abuse of sovereignty, but to excess government. And by its reference to excess government, or to any rate the delimitation of what would be excessive for government, is what makes it possible to gauge the rationality of governmental practice. From this point on, it is not merely a government but also its critics or its citizens who judge the government primarily based on the scope of success or failure rather than legitimacy or illegitimacy. Perhaps one of the most stunning figures of the age of liberal governmentality has to be the most popular pamphleteer of the 18th century, Thomas Paine, who, in at least two aspects. Of course, we may or may not be aware that Thomas Paine's disgust for the sovereign power, but what makes him so compelling as a picture of his time was first his strong physiocratic leanings, and the other to the extent that he thought that a free and open markets was not only the responsibility of the state, but also the belief that blocking the natural market would lead inevitably to despotism and war. Consequently, this is also the position that Kant holds in his essay on perpetual peace. Now, I think it is important to be clear on the assertion. For all the deviations of liberalism, especially in the 19th century, what we almost never see is the changing of the main questions or purposes of governance at this point. For instance, the United States was all about free trade at first. Not more than a decade later, it turns around all its practices for protectionism. We can only smile wryly, though, when we know it is understood that the reasons are, in fact, to keep the local markets free and to maintain the natural balance from others. In fact, more to the point, the correct actions of the government for this or that tariff was justified precisely through a liberal discourse of keeping the natural balance to the market. Again, Focault explains. In other words, it is the natural price that enables us to falsify and verify governmental practice when, on the basis of these elements, we examine what government does, the measures that it takes, the rules it imposes. In a sense, inasmuch as it enables production, need, supply, demand, value, and price, etc., to be linked together through exchange, the market constitutes a site of veridiction, which means, proving itself through truth. It is interesting to hear people talk about the freedoms that were enjoyed as a result in turn from feudalism, and to a certain extent, some credit should be given to liberalism in its advances. The genesis of problems that evoke the talk about primal beginning and original contracts are not only completely ideological, but suffer from being endemic to the times that they were created. Prior even to the talk about Hobbes's life, liberty, and property, the only talk, indeed the only intelligible speech on rights, was the right of kings, which talked about things like mine by right of conquest and other such pleasantries. This little detour about rights and freedoms does have a purpose, though. Genealogy shows that the freedom of liberalisms are constructed. Focault illuminates. So freedom in the regime of liberalism is not a given. It's not a ready-made region that has to be respected, or if it is so only partially, regionally, in this case or that case, etc. Freedom is something which must be constantly produced. Liberal is not an acceptance of freedom. It proposes to manufacture it constantly, to arouse it, to produce it, with, of course, the constraints and the problems of the cost raised by its own production. What then will be the principle of calculation for the cost of this manufacturing of freedom? The principle of calculation will be called security. Now, from a non-moralizing point of view, it's obvious to infer that genealogy shows us that our desires for a certain configuration of freedom is highly manufactured by knowledge power that informs us. A certain utopia of liberalism is achieved as a result. What are the freedoms? What is the maximum horizon of freedom, etc.? Thus, it's not hypocritical to impose some intervention on liberal governments as a part to maintain the freedoms through their face of security, which, fair to say that more intelligibly, would be like, it's not at all hypocritical for classical liberalism to create all sorts of weird securities because they are the alternate face of the freedoms that it creates. It's a necessary component. Even in the middle of this ostensibly hands-off heyday of classical liberalism, we see that biopower, this time in the form of biopolitics, starts to take some effects. As liberalism provided the discourse of knowledge and freedom, it also is necessary with its definition of freedom, create and provide security. When this is mentioned, it conjures up police protecting rich people's rights, and of course, while it means this too, it also means that it's applied in a lot more subtle ways. For instance, one of the guarantees of that the markets will remain free in their natural state is a commodity called labor, and that is important that it remains plentiful. Now, I think I know where some of you think where I'm going with this, but again, I need to remind you that disciplinary knowledge, even of this particular configuration of biopolitics, doesn't come from the top down, nor from one person. I want to use two examples of reproduction and population, the first of which is European, and the second, which remains a lot closer to home in terms of this type of security created. In Europe, and especially in England, there developed at the time a new knowledge of the family. The effects and the purposes came from all over the map, moral health being the most genuine and the most primary. Families, many of which had been chased from the countryside only generations earlier, lived in domiciles the way that they did in rural areas. But they were encouraged by educators, clergy, and even sometimes by ordinance to make sure that families slept in different beds, and that boys and girls had their own room, etc. Houses and apartments that they could rent were all constructed in a certain way to encourage this new division of the family. And from a capitalist standpoint, this acclimated families to round-the-clock shift work and separated each member. It is at the time that institutions like the church started preaching heavily against the sexual practice commonly referred to now as pulling out, where previously, and for sordid reasons, there was no such reason to do so. Doing so at all levels using biopower, we were able to create a form of security and maintain the new needs for new freedoms through domestication. The second, more local example to Utah Valley University is the practice of polygamy to the immigrants that came to the state, the Mormons. Never had the comment replenish the earth taken on such a strong injunction as it did when the Mormons entered what is now Utah. The encouragement of polygamy in Utah was a clear need to maintain security that the Mormons needed both economics and in the political sense to survive. The practice of polygamy in Utah is a small cosmos of biopolitics par excellence. Again, it wasn't merely a top-down religious institution that allowed and encouraged. It affected all facets of life. The way that they worked together, the buildings that they built, and of course the way they took care of one another in terms of welfare. Even now we can see that some of the knowledge and disciplines of the family still expose their disparate nature, where Utah still is one of the few places in the U.S. that has large family sizes. Again, power is extremely decentralized and can be attributed to the existence of continued popularity of Costco as much as it is any religion. But I digress. Here we have a very palpable example of biopolitics and its eyes on economy and security in the United States in the 19th century. Up until this moment, I've only alluded to the clashes and differences between liberal style and governmentality and capitalism. However, when we start at the very beginning of the 20th century in America, we start to see the necessity of biopower has to capitalism take on a somewhat larger role, especially in the cases of public education and health. The liberal economists at the time saw that it was necessary to develop what they deemed human capital. But to treat genealogy seriously, the development of both education and health was greatly bolstered by both Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller for genuinely different and philanthropic reasons. When we examine the expansion of biopolitics, we should recognize a couple of important things here. First is that though these figures were both ruthless capitalists, and as a result laid down the stonework for industrial expansion, that in their later lives, they had a genuine goal of welfare. The purpose of education was actually to liberate, and they were serious about that. What remains crucial here is not these two making an effort to privatize everything, but exactly the opposite, to bolster a fledgling public educational model. Thereby, even though through the scope of liberal charity, it is still an expansion of welfare and a purview of the state. Here power emanates from the places other than from the state or from business. It comes from churches, philanthropists, and even old school abolitionists. Even so, we see an increasing development of biopolitics, but a slow chiseling away of the sort of freedoms of classical liberalism, especially from the political economic perspective, and then also a bolstering of capitalism, which shows a split. The liberal governmentality of this classical variety ran into a few snags or upstarts in the relationship to new knowledges and the new relationship of ruling. Here in the United States, we experienced a very rosy maturation of capitalism, continuing through the Gilded Age and even far into the Great Depression. Because as you recall, Hoover adhered tightly to liberal governmentality in the name of freedom and even in the name of security. But the introduction of Keynesian-style economics started to challenge not so much liberal governmentality, but the precepts of political economics. In the face of disaster, the old model, the government that governs least governs best, was falling out of favor of style with the government and reconfigured its security. Over in Europe, liberal governmentality had several bumps in the road as well, the major challengers being both Prussia and then later on Germany. Of course, I'm referring to Bismarck's social insurance programs and later on National Socialism. In the cases of the liberals in Europe, they fought fiercely against both programs, and in the case of later, many individuals were actually chased out of the country. Prior to the Third Reich's rise to power, the German academics of the liberal political economy enjoyed something that resides between a renaissance and a crisis. Around Europe, they saw a strong turn to government intervention due to the perceived threat of both communism and the self-destructive behavior of capitalism. Power here seemed to be reversing the reversed flow on political economy, rather than the normal political economy to liberal governmentality, political economy to liberal governmentality. The icon and consequent rallying point of this theoretical shift was a journal called Ordo. In Foucault's Birth of Biopolitics, these new style of liberals emerged in the early part of the 20th century as Europe were known as the Ordo liberals. But for the purposes of this lecture, I will concatenate them to their American counterparts, the Neo-Liberals. But this is because they mostly have everything in common except for where they live. For instance, a lot of steam picked up, just as an example, a lot of steam picked up on the American side of Neo-Liberalism around the same time when an Ordo liberal by the name of Friedrich von Hayek was chased out of Germany and eventually found his way easily fitted into the United States Chicago School, just for one example. The Neo-Liberals lashed themselves to the new types of markets and fledgling governmentalities, but some of the tenets of classical liberalism had to be consigned to the past. On a roughly fair analysis, we could say that the problem was to demonstrate that capitalism was still possible and could survive if a new form was invented for it. Their proposition was that only neo-liberals could save capitalism. This is, of course, why they're called neoliberals, because they have a strong demarcation that lies in the idea that there are no natural markets. The new job of the government is to promote competition in order to secure freedom. Foucault remarks that, they say, laissez-faire cannot and must not be the conclusion drawn from the principle of competition as the organizing farm of the market. Why not? Because they say if you deduce the principle of laissez-faire from a market economy, basically you're still in the grips of what is called naive naturalism. As such, neoliberalism should not therefore be identified with laissez-faire, but rather with permanent vigilance, activity, and intervention. Here we can see that the neoliberal conception fits more neatly into our current style of governmentality as opposed to the classical liberal approach. It might also illuminate why people who cry about the free market and government intervention seem to be missing the point, even though they appear both liberal and capitalist. This is because they are chasing the ghosts of capitalism past. The neoliberal argument prior to World War II obviously did not hold much sway. After the war, however, the liberals couldn't ask for more ideal conditions. They argued that Keynesian-style interventions and that any style of governmentality that didn't protect competition in the market was doomed to either Nazism or communism. They ended up with a perfect storm of influences, albeit for different reasons, around the world. The examination of proliferation filled another lecture, that's not our task here. Neoliberalism has the catalytic effect on biopolitics. The reason that this makes this proliferation of biopolitics so easy is due to the way that neoliberalism generates subjectivity. Classical liberalism, according to neoliberalism, misses the point of labor in its analysis of labor. Classical liberalism turns to labor as an ideologically abstract labor power. It turns it into a commodity and makes it intelligible in the logic of capital. Neoliberals claim that the abstraction of labor as it occurs is not due to real capitalism, but is as a result of classical economic theory itself. In the past, people followed the contrived logic of capital, which created the abstraction of labor into labor power. The neoliberals say that capitalism requires a new logic so that it can unshackle labor from this old model. The classical economist studies of economics as a relationship to production, exchange, and consumption, and the interrelatedness of these three domains in a given social structure. For the neoliberal economist, and to quote, economics is a science of human behavior as a relationship of ends and scarce means which have mutually exclusive uses. And Foucault adds aptly, economics is therefore not an analysis of processes, it is an analysis of activities. So it is no longer an analysis of a historical logic of processes, it is the analysis of internal rationality and strategic programming of people's individual activity. Consequently, the questions or purview of labor in neoliberalism is not asking what is the good price for labor or what is the labor value that's forged into this commodity, but rather it puts ourselves in the shoes of the worker and asks questions like, how do I work? What decisions do I make? What does my work mean to me? And how do I value it? This has the strange effect of removing the worker from the picture of analysis. We do not ask questions of the social relationships or mechanisms between people, but instead occupy some place economically where those relationships to the worker is hidden from view. This changes the game significantly. I can't ask questions like, what is a fair wage? I can only ask questions like, what is a fair wage to me? These basic questions, or rather answers to these questions, have been provided, form a new knowledge of economics. The reasoning goes like this. From a personal point of view, a wage for me is just another form of income. And income, by definition, is just a return on capital. Capital is just a resource that can be used to produce future income. Thus, the reasoning continues such that I am an income stream. In a certain sense, I am a capitalist that produces capital, though I am a special form of capital because I'm inseparable from my own production of capital. By this analysis, you aren't a worker who sells his labor for a wage, as this again would only put you at the level of mechanism, but precisely the individual of classical liberalism disappears. Foucault explains, the idea of the basic element to be deciphered by economic analysis is not so much the individual or the processes or mechanism, but enterprises. An economy made up of enterprise units, a society made of enterprise units is at once the principle of decipherment linked to liberalism and its programming for the rationalization of society and economy. So to the neoliberal, you are an enterprise, homo economicus. Here now we sit in our chairs and we can remember the discourse as it talks about us as a business rather than a person in the classical sense. We invest in our children's futures. We think that education is a good investment. What marketable skills do I have? These phrases give human capital a whole new dimension. With a liberal governmentality that is informed by neoliberalism, the stakes are quite different to the previous counterpart. Governmentality is measured and tested on its ability to protect and incite competition in the market. The previous wisdom of governing in the least still rings true, but only insofar as it incites the market further. The new liberalism requires that government have permanent vigilance, activity, and intervention in order to create the security for competition. Biopolitics does not work on the level of individuals, it works on the level of populations. And if we add this modified theory of governmentality to the resubjectivizing forces of Homo economicus, we have a sort of ideal collusion between these two similar approaches. Neoliberals make a severe break with the examination of human subjectivity and reason from that of, say, the Italian Renaissance, but is still humanist in a way, and in some ways is hyper-humanistic. With neoliberalism, all the questions are emanated in the subject itself. It is, to be very sure, a different form of humanism from before it, but it concerns itself with the study of the individual, scientifically even, as an enterprise. The collusion of biopolitics works similarly with neoliberal subjectivity because they both share the similar knowledge of the body. With biopolitics, an economic security of population, and with neoliberalism, a desire to protect competition and enterprises. They, of course, are not equivocal, but one notices they seem somewhat complementary in their knowledge and effects on people. If we compare this with classical liberalism, with its injunctions against personal intervention, biopower over population seems somewhat inert or even contradictory to this this classical liberalism. There may be some of you that doubt the penetration of neoliberal subjectivity in various non-economic domains. I've already alluded to some of these seemingly unlikely domains, but I wanted to make it more explicit in order to show how particularly well biopolitics works in the frame and scope of neoliberalism. As Foucault says, American neoliberalism still involves, in fact, the generalization of the economic form of the market. It involves generalizing it through the social body, including the whole of the social system that's not even usually conducted or sanctioned by monetary exchanges. Thus, all the problems of, say, healthcare or public hygiene, for example, must be at any rate, or can be, rethought as elements that may or may not improve human capital. It is interesting to see the pervasiveness of this new subjectivity. Take healthcare, for instance. Now, it is easy to see where the monetary side of neoliberal subjectivity comes in. That is easy enough at a certain level to discern. What becomes particularly interesting is the non-economic sides, but the knowledge generated by non-economic side of healthcare. It should be of no surprise to anyone that in the United States rates itself as #1 in comparison to other countries for healthcare. As an outsider, one might ask how it's said that that could be honest at all, but believe it or not, due to the way that they measure things, it is. For most of the rest of the world, the success of a healthcare system examines its ability to keep a population healthy. It measures its overall system's ability to keep to maintain or distribute healthcare. In the United States, the primary metric for determining the success is customer satisfaction. How do I relate to my healthcare? Am I satisfied with its performance? Statements like 79% of Americans feel like healthcare treats them satisfactorily or better constitutes a form of knowledge about healthcare. These questions should be familiar because they are the types usually associated with economic transaction, but it's worth delineating that these questions are not questions as to whether or not it's worth their money, but whether or not how you grade healthcare itself. The survey style, which became popular about the same time as the rise of neoliberalism, neoliberal economics, shows this subjective relativity aptly. It is often typical that a survey will be, on any given topic, will contain the all too ambiguous 1 through 5 scale. One example of asking something might be along the lines of, "It rained today," followed by 1 to 5 bubbles. You'll notice some strange things about this. First, it's not a question. Second, there are only 2 answers to the question, 3 if you include the "I don't know" option. And if you're trying to, it seems like you're trying to ascertain the taker as to whether or not he knows the state of weather. However, with a neoliberal subjectivity, the thing that is being measured is not if you know the answer, but your relatability to the phrase. How does this agree to you? How does this make you react? The rise and effects of survey, especially in politics, is a telling in terms of knowledge and subsequent determination of the truth of what people want, like, and need. The penetration of the survey in this manner of rendering this penetration of the surveys is rendering you as an object of knowledge is not merely in the domain of customer satisfaction, but is even used in things like psychological assessment. Just to throw one more concrete example of how neoliberalism is applied to anything under the sun here in the United States, we only need to look at the American solution for reducing carbon emissions. The solution to the problem seems only natural that air, previously never dreamt as being an object of trade or competition, transmutes into a commodity so that we can solve the problem. The problem thus can be solved by opening up new avenues of competition, which can make everything better by its technological innovations. The government here is doing its job according to liberal governmentality par excellence. Before we wrap up, I think it's paramount to address a few concerns about people's uses of biopolitics, and in doing so clarify what biopolitics is not. When one studies Foucault's biopolitics, it's worth pointing out to the extent of how limited it is due to the definition that's provided. It's highly contingent. Biopolitics is under the genus of biopower, which it shares with micropower, or what is known as the discourse of individual bodies through movements. There's also a third type of biopower that is a micropower, but also works on populations rather than the individual level, but isn't under the purview of political economics. This third category isn't explicitly named, but perhaps if you're more comfortable with ambiguity, you might label it non-microdisciplinary powers. If we were filling out a diagram, biopolitics would be inset that particular distinction with the dotted line to liberal governmentality. So that's a little complicated. I wish I had a blackboard to show it to you, but it is actually relevant. In the context of this presentation at the Revolutionary Students' Union, I would like to talk a moment about the way that people use him in analysis in the sparking revolution. Most of the mistakes come from the misunderstanding of Foucault's notion of power, which I've already talked about briefly, but we'll elaborate where people have pitfalls. To my knowledge, and my confidence on this is fairly high, Foucault's theory of power does not permit an outside to power. In fact, the knot that forms knowledge power doesn't allow there to be a power outside either. Foucault is explicit about this in his later work, where, for instance, here's in a later book, History of Sexuality, Volume 1. Where there's power, there is resistance, and yet, or rather consequently, this resistance is never in a position of exteriority in the relationship to power. Their existence depends on a multiplicity of points of resistance. These play the role of adversary, target, support, and handle of power relations. These points of resistance are present everywhere in the power network. The misunderstanding of the outside power usually stems from a misunderstanding of Foucault's project. Often these are those who conceive his work as a provocation to find some sort of outside platform to reside, or some sort of outside platform to launch resistance from. But on the issues of outside powers, it's only fair intellectually to delineate between those that think there must be an outside power to those that merely wish it was the case. The second mistake is that people are liable to make is seeing genealogy as forward-looking. Genealogy, as I have indicated at the beginning of this lecture, is very reliant on historical analysis, and it might be said is intrinsically material. Determining the truth of any particular moment requires an evaluation of various artifacts of time, the books, the art, the music, the reports, speeches, etc., and how those tokens speak to the discourse or truth of that moment. One thing that stands out particularly about genealogy is its fundamental inability to determine the cause or the change in knowledge power. It is not capable, but in addition is not interested in it. For instance, in the case of liberal governmentality, Foucault says, I do not think that we need to look for, and consequently, I don't think that we need to find the cause of the constitution of the market as an agency of erudition. If we take the abilities of genealogy all the way to its limit, it may be helpful in determining what knowledge power is working at this very moment. But it's worth pointing out as well that genealogy, to this extent, is excellent. It's what it portends to do. That being said, its inability to find or analyze that revolutionary moment makes its applicability to those particular causes virtually zero. I know that some of you may have some questions about certain thinkers. I'll be happy to answer those questions in a Q&A immediately after I'm done, which is really soon. Okay, home stretch. Some of you may be cooking up a genealogical analysis of your own and concerns to our contemporary society. I would take these last moments to take Foucault's own reasoning of biopolitics to the end. As cited at the beginning of the lecture, biopolitics is something that happens when biopower is exposed to liberal governmentality. However, due to various accomplishments and security of capitalism in the forms of production, we notice a whole new rash of developments in the forms of knowledge concerning the multiplicity of domains, especially with the advent of new technologies. If we look at the needs of security and competition, we can see that the parameters of security has in fact changed. That being said, I think there's a fair amount of reason, especially in the recent economic recession, to believe that the intervention and incitement of competition is still the main goal, at least here in the United States. Thus, with a Foucauldian analysis, it seems that liberal governmentality is still here in full force. And that's all I have. Thank you. All right, we'll take questions now from the crowd.
Or from the population.
The population and the crowd, they could be the same thing. All right, shoot. Who's got a question for me and my interpretation of Foucault? All right, then.
I guess one of the things we talked about earlier, could you clarify biopower and give examples of it?
Yes. So biopower is a type of knowledge, a discourse, and essentially like a sort of discipline of being that can be contrasted to its earlier form. Biopower is power over life, as opposed to the power that preceded over it, which is the power of death, the power of the sovereign. Like in Foucault's book, Discipline and Punish, the very beginning of the book goes to demonstrate that the type of controls that were pushed over people don't tell you what to do per se, it just tells you what you can't do. And the way it shows you what you can't do is that it tortures you to death very mercilessly. You know, the type of powers that you would have is a sort of power of a demonstration of the sovereign over death. But what happens is, as you have a sort of transition away from the sovereign as being the reason for everything, you know, it's just like, oh, well, you've offended the corpus of the king and things like this. You move on towards different disciplinary powers, which of course is linked to things like liberalism and things like this, but also other institutions like clocks and monks and stuff. But the power over life doesn't tell you what not to do. It tells you what to do and how to do it, and the things to be worried about. So, like, a really good example of this is, you know, something like I gave in the lecture, like a knowledge about yourself. How do I feel today? Or the, actually, let me bring up this one as a sort of example. What is it that makes people think that they ought to be happy? And the things that make them happy, or the questions or the constant concern with happiness. I mean, I know there's a psychoanalytic sort of side to that evaluation, but we have a whole proliferation, a discourse, if you will, the way that people talk about themselves in terms of, you know, the way that they do it. For instance, I received this question at my job yesterday. You know, what would be your ideal job, right? What is meant by this by general people is, what is the job that would make it so you're happy and felt like you weren't working? Which, of course, in a completely different discourse, happiness has nothing to do with what it is that you should be doing, right? The way that, say, for instance, something like the imposition of happiness, that you enjoy yourself, is something that would be considered a biopolitical power over you. So that would be an example of how it controls you in a certain sense, making yourself happy. Yeah.
I guess then, given the context of biopower, what would you say, this sort of speaks to Hart and Negri, what would you say is their, how do you see them as interpreting it as a revolutionary project, and do you see them being successful with the notions of biopower and the biopolitical?
Yeah, it's worth pointing out that Hart and Negri have a sort of evaluation of biopolitics the way that I presented it somewhat, except for there is a ton of emphasis on subjectivities in terms of what they call biopolitics. They actually almost always refer to as biopolitical production. And the reason why is I think that they have a fundamentally different understanding of basically power, the way that it works, from, I would say, a majority of the people that do work on Foucault. And the reason why is they interpret that the subjectivity that's generated from biopower or biopolitics is not the subjectivity that I created in the lecture, that I showed in the lecture, where, you know, you yourself is the subject and you get to ask all these questions about yourself instead of the mechanisms. What it says is that there are resistances to biopolitics, and that each one of those resistance creates a new subjectivity. So what biopolitics does is, by having these multiple resistance, creates a sort of like unlimited amount of subjectivities, right? Not the ones where you view yourself as, you know, in the logic of capital, or whether or not you're a happy machine to bioliberalism, but your own new little fancy subjectivity that is not affected by anything, but instead is the resistance. I particularly think that that interpretation of the way that Foucault uses resistances as not being there. The reason why is, anytime you're engaging in a resistance, you're A, never outside of power. B, in order to be inside the realm of power, you have to have some sort of intelligibility about yourself. But there is no real other intelligibilities being created. Because if you are a new intelligibility, you're what? Knowledge, therefore power. You're not a resistance, you're just a different competing power. Where I think that it falls flat in any sort of revolutionary sense is the fact that I think that they believe that they're generating new subjectivities off this resistance to biopolitics, but I don't think it ever escapes the sort of biopolitical subjectivity created by neoliberalism. Like, just the examples I brought up about depressions and making yourself this better, like, human source of capital. You need to invest in an education. What is this value to you? The way you talk about yourself. I don't think people are escaping that the way that they think they are. I mean, maybe there are different sources of power, but it's the way that they talk about the theory of power in relationship to Foucault, resistances, and the generations of subjectivity. I don't think that's there. And I think it's highly dependent on their work, and so I just think it's wrong. Yeah.
I'm trying to think of how to formulate this question, but the way that Foucault writes about power is like not being top down. This also makes me think about like, gosh, how to phrase this, but these things are not fresh on my mind because I haven't read this stuff in a long time, but
it's complicated even when you read it yesterday.
it is, yeah. But and also we were talking earlier about history of sexuality part 1 and how we kind of like compose these like taxonomies of desire or self-definition or something.
Mm-hmm.
These are like nexes for power, or like points of like points where power comes into play. I can't remember how he would say it, but it seems to me like when I read that, it was kind of like a reversal of like other notions of power that I read about before.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of want to try to ask you a question about whether that runs parallel to like Baudrillardian flip from like looking at society from, or economics from like a productivist standpoint to like a consumerist one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the way, first of all, it's hard for me to speak to Baudrillard, only because I haven't read him. So that means that I can blow a lot of hot air, but
yeah, I mean,
insofar,
I haven't really read him either.
So insofar as what you've described to me, I mean, there is a sort of way in which the change from classical liberalism to neoliberalism might be a puzzle piece that kind of fits similar to what you're talking about. Before, of course, in classical liberalism, it's all about, life, liberty, property, and things like this, right? And this sort of incitement to make sure you're protected as an individual. But when you look at things like production and enterprise and competition, that's the big switch to neoliberal sort of thinking. And before, you had an examination of mechanisms, like which is to say, I'm a worker and I trade my labor power and things like this, but by assuming that everybody's this sort of hyper-humanistic point of view according to economics, what it is it becomes a study of human behavior scientifically par excellence. So it doesn't study mechanisms, it studies you and how to change you, right? So it asks questions. I mean, we don't need to assume a necessarily nefarious nature. I mean, here with the RSU, obviously, we know it's nefarious and doing this. But the thing is we don't need to assume the necessary nefarious nature. I mean, a lot of these people that are like von Hayek and stuff like this, he received the Medal of Freedom and by Bush Sr. I mean, they really think they're doing you a really good favor when you get to ask questions like, well, what does this labor mean to me? Not necessarily if it's fair for everyone or if it's fair to the system or whatever, So when we shift to that direction, we really have a shift in emphasis that because we're occluding things to the picture, they really become in the forefront of activity. But it's just not personal activities, it's mechanisms become, I don't know, on steroids or something like this. Does that address the question that you were asking? Or
I'll hit the books and I'll get back to you.
I wanted to mention maybe something about different conceptions of power. I mean, Foucault definitely has a different notion of power, like say contra Hannah Arendt or Benjamin or something like this when it comes to the relationship between power and violence. Somebody once told me that power is never violence, and that is not true. Like, I'm sorry, it's just not like. There are particular points in his literature.
Is that based on a reading of him? Because I could almost see how one could like.
Yeah, I mean, well, like, this is where the distinction kind of comes, right? The notion is that you're not really exercising knowledge on somebody when you're beating the crap out of them or incarcerating them or something like this. But of course, nobody knows the truth of something more than, you know, like, say, for instance, the truth of police power than when you're having the crap beaten out of you. You know, so part of power is not merely knowledge, but it's also discipline. Right? That's the other side of it. So, you know, and especially the case before biopower, where the power over you is the power over death, right? You know, that can only be exercised in a form of violence over you, right? It's never telling you what to do, it's just telling you not what to do, and it'll tell you when you're stepped out of bounds. So, there's that. Anything else? No, okay. Alright guys, let's get out of here.